It was November 1979. In Tehran, the US Embassy was overrun. 52 Americans were taken hostage, held captive, invisible to the world, in one of the longest and most humiliating standoffs in American history. For President Jimmy Carter, recovery of the hostage became his defining mission and fatal burden. But as 1980's presidential election loomed, rumors began to swirl. What if someone, somewhere, sought to keep the hostages just a little bit longer? What if the fate of those Americans was used as a lever in a political game no one would even admit existed? This is the story of the October surprise. In the fall of 1979, America washed with a mix of horror and helplessness. On November 4th, Iranian radicals stormed the US Embassy in Tehran, seizing dozens of American diplomats and citizens. The world was stunned. The revolution in Iran had swept away the old order, and now it held America's reputation hostage. The captives would remain in captivity for 444 days, becoming both pawns and symbols in a war of ideologies. Jimmy Carter, only 3 years into his presidency, found himself trapped between diplomacy, domestic pressure, and a media that turned every hour into a test of leadership. His approval ratings, once buoyed by idealism, teetered on crisis. The hostage crisis became central to American identity. It exposed fragility of executive power, of public trust, of the role of the United States in a rapidly shifting world. As 1980 dawned, the election loomed. Carter would face a fierce challenge in Ronald Reagan. In that volatile moment, a question was whispered. What if one side attempted to manipulate the hostages' release, the very symbol of American dignity, for political gain? That question became the heart of the October surprise controversy. From the outset, the crisis was complex. The Iranian Revolution had overthrown the Shah, a longtime US ally. The new regime distrusted American intentions. When the Shah was admitted to the US for cancer treatment, Tehran saw it as interference and responded by retaliating in the most dramatic way possible, taking hostages. Carter had to balance delicate diplomacy with public pressure. He tried sanctions, negotiations, and secret overtures. He resisted calls for military rescue until the urgency became unbearable. In April 1980, Carter launched Operation Eagle Claw, a daring rescue mission into Iran. The plan failed catastrophically. Mechanical failures, poor conditions, and a fatal helicopter crash left 8 US servicemen dead. The failure was a blow to American prestige and to Carter's political standing. The president privately vowed that he would get the hostages home, but publicly he faced critics who accused him of weakness and indecision. Negotiations continued through Algiers as a moderator, but each passing month without progress sapped public confidence. The hostage crisis became not just a foreign policy issue, but a domestic political liability. By 1980, Carter's presidency was in deep trouble. The economy was sagging, inflation soared, and the public mood felt pessimistic. The hostage crisis became a symbol of American impotence. Carter, once a political outsider promising a new kind of honesty, now appeared trapped. Critics said he lacked toughness. His rivals said he lacked clarity. Meanwhile, Republicans sensed opportunity. Ronald Reagan, former governor of California, embraced optimism, patriotism, and a promise of American renewed. His campaign attacked Carter for weakness and suggested only a new leader could rescue America's standing. The hostage crisis, unresolved, became a political weapon. Carter met with aides and advisors in the White House Situation Room, revisiting every negotiation channel. He gripped the weight of history. If the hostages were freed early, it would redeem his presidency. If not, he risked defeat, possibly in no small part because of this crisis. The term October surprise originally referred to the fear that Carter might engineer a dramatic release of the hostages just before the election, a political maneuver to bolster his reelection chances. Reagan's camp and the Republican strategists watched closely, bracing for that possibility. In the spring and summer of 1980, there were vague warnings in the press and campaign statements about potential surprises in October. It was a war of nerves more than facts, each side whispering theories, preparing defenses, and watching Tehran. Yet, the allegations that Reagan's camp might have secretly negotiated with Iranian officials to delay the hostages' release until after November, in fact weaponizing human lives for electoral advantage, was still in the shadowy infancy. That was the October surprise theory that would later consume congressional inquiries, historians, and public debate. In this charged atmosphere of secrecy, fear, and strategic posturing, we see that the stage was set, hostages held, a president weakened, an opposition rising, and allegations whispered from back corridors. It is August 1980. The Republican National Convention has just wrapped. Ronald Reagan stands at the podium, the crowd thundering around him. "We must restore America's strength," he says, smiling with the confidence of a man who believes history is turning in his favor. But behind the spectacles, behind the flags, the slogans, the chants of USA, there were whispers. Whispers of a meeting, whispers of a promise that somewhere, somehow, a message had been sent to Tehran. Wait, don't release the hostages yet. Help is coming after the election. By the summer of 1980, the presidential race was tightening. Carter was trailing, but not hopelessly. The hostages remained in Iran, and negotiations through Algerian intermediaries still flickered with possibilities. In Washington, Carter's National Security Council tracked every rumor, every whisper of progress. The president's aides believed that a breakthrough might come in late October. But as the White House scrambled to secure the hostages' release, something strange began to appear in the diplomatic shadows. Multiple sources, years later, would allege that emissaries connected to the Reagan campaign including campaign manager William Casey, later to become the CIA director, might have reached out to Iranian intermediaries, the alleged goal to delay any deal until after the election day. If Carter succeeded, he might win. If he failed, Reagan almost certainly would. The supposed message to Tehran was simple and chilling. You'll get a better deal from us. It was a claim with no definitive proof, but one that would haunt American political history for decades. Years later, congressional investigations, journalists, and witnesses would point to a series of alleged secret meetings. The most infamous took place supposedly in Madrid during the summer of 1980, and later in Paris that fall. According to accounts from various sources, among them were Iranian businessman Jamshid Hashemi, former Iranian officials, and even French intelligence contacts. Casey and other intermediaries may have met representatives of the new Iranian regime. The argument, as described, Iran would hold the hostages until after Reagan's election victory. In return, the new administration would unfreeze Iranian assets and facilitate future arms shipments. But here's the problem: no hard evidence ever confirmed these meetings. Flight logs, travel schedules, and official records largely contradicted the timelines. Some witnesses recanted and changed their stories. Others insisted the cover-up was simply that good. What's undeniable is by late 1980, Iran appeared unwilling to release the hostages, despite months of progress. Whether by coincidence or collusion, the timing aligned perfectly with political interest in Washington. As the campaign reached its final weeks, the hostage crisis dominated every headline. Americans tuned in nightly, waiting for any sign of release. On television, newscasters speculated daily: would the hostages come home before the vote? Carter's staff worked tirelessly, contacting intermediaries in Algeria, Switzerland, and even the United Nations. Each time, hopes rose, and each time, they fell. By late October, optimism faded. The Iranians appeared to be dragging their feet. Some in Carter's administration speculated political motives, but they couldn't prove it. Carter later wrote in his memoir that he felt the closer we got to Election Day, the less likely their release seemed. On November 4th, 1980, as Americans voted, the hostages were still captive. That night, Carter lost in a landslide. Ronald Reagan swept into office on promises of renewal and strength. The hostages' fate was sealed, at least for the next 77 days. Here's where the story becomes uncanny. On January 20th, 1981, the very moment Reagan took the oath of office, the hostages were released. Television viewers saw it live, the new president smiling at his inauguration as planes lifted off from Tehran. The timing was extraordinary. Carter, who had spent his final days negotiating through Algerian intermediaries, watched the news aboard a government plane, escorting the free hostages home. He had done the work, but the moment of triumph belonged to someone else. Iran claimed it was coincidental, that they wanted to avoid the appearance of favoring Carter. Reagan's camp denied any prior contact. But to millions of Americans, it looked deliberate, too perfect, too convenient. It was the moment that turned suspicion into legend. The October surprise, was born. In the years that followed, rumors grew louder. Former intelligence officers, journalists, and even foreign diplomats began sharing fragments of information. Some pointed to William Casey's strange travel schedule. Others cited armed deals that had soon followed, part of what would later be linked to the Iran-Contra affair. In 1988, Gary Sick, a former Carter aide, published an explosive op-ed in the New York Times, and later a book, alleging that the Reagan campaign had indeed made a secret deal. Congress eventually launched a formal investigation in the early 1990s. The result? Inconclusive. The House and Senate both found no credible evidence of a deal, though they acknowledged that the circumstantial coincidences were striking. Critics said the inquiry was limited, that too many documents were sealed or destroyed. Supporters said the allegations were a conspiracy theory built on rumor and resentment. Either way, the October surprise entered the bloodstream of American political mythology, a ghost story about power, morality, and manipulation. The hostages came home, but the questions never left. Did a secret bargain shape the course of an election? Or was it simply the cruel coincidence of history? An old empire humiliated, a new power ascends? It's 1988. The Reagan years are drawing to a close. The Cold War is fading. The economy is booming. The American story feels confident again. But in quiet corners of Washington, a question begins to stir, one that refuses to die. What if the Reagan Revolution was born in deceit? What if the seeds of victory in 1980 were planted not in the ballot box, but in the shadows of Tehran? The 1980s had been good to Ronald Reagan. His presidency saw economic resurgence, a shift towards conservatism, and renewed American pride. But by the late 80s, cracks began to show. Scandals, overreach, and the slow unraveling of a myth. First came Iran-Contra, the revelation that Reagan's administration had secretly sold arms to Iran to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. It stunned the country, and for some, it raised a haunting question. Had this kind of deal happened before? Among those asking was Gary Sick, a former National Security Council aide under Carter. Sick had spent years studying the 1980s election and his connection to the hostage crisis. What he found, or believed he found, was chilling. In 1991, he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, followed by his book, October Surprise: America's Hostages in Iran in the Election of Ronald Reagan. He claimed that Reagan's campaign, led by William Casey, had made a secret deal with Tehran to delay the hostages' release in exchange for future military assistance. His allegations reignited an old fire. For the first time, the US Congress would be forced to confront it. In 1991, Congress opened two formal inquiries, one in the House, one in the Senate. The task before them was monumental: to determine whether the 1980s Reagan campaign had interfered with US foreign policy to win an election. Witnesses were called, documents were subpoenaed, investigators combed through travel logs, intelligence files, and diplomatic cables. The trail led from Washington to Paris, from Madrid to Tehran, tracing decade-old rumors through the bureaucratic fog of two administrations. The hearing uncovered testimony from figures like Jamshi Hashemi, who claimed to have arranged a meeting in Madrid between William Casey and Iranian intermediaries. Other witnesses described seeing Americans, some they say were a part of Reagan's team, in Paris, supposedly negotiating the delay. But the evidence was murky. Flight records didn't line up. Hotel registrations conflicted. Many memories were 20 years old. The investigation began to look less like a smoking gun and more like a ghost hunt. One of the biggest pieces of supposed evidence came from Ari Ben Manas, an Israeli intelligence officer who claimed he had personally seen members of Reagan's campaign in Europe. He even named names: Casey, George H.W. Bush, and others. But his credibility crumbled under scrutiny. He provided no verifiable proof, no photographs, no records, no corroborating witnesses. Still, his claims add oxygen to a fire that refused to burn out. Journalists dug deeper. Frontline, The New Republic, and The Village Voice all ran major stories, each chasing fragments of truth through a fog of denial. At the time, evidence seemed tantalizingly close, but always just beyond reach. By the spring of 1933, the House and Senate issued their final reports. The verdict: no credible evidence support the allegation that members of the Reagan campaign conspired to delay the release of the hostages. To many Americans, that was the end. But to others, especially those who lived through the Carter years, it felt like a whitewash. Even in the 1990s, the question wasn't just about history, it was about morality. If the allegations were true, they would represent one of the most cynical manipulations of American democracy in history, using human lives as leverage for political power. If false, then a generation of political paranoia had been built on coincidence and distrust. Either way, the episode deepened America's growing skepticism towards the government, a skepticism that had begun with Watergate and would only expand through the Iran-Contra, Whitewater, and beyond. Inside the archives of Congress, the October surprise file were sealed away. Casey had died years earlier. Reagan had retired to California. Bush had become president, then left office. The major players were gone, but the story refused to rest. By the time the investigation concluded, the phrase October surprise had entered the political lexicon, shorthand for any last-minute event or scandal that could alter an election's outcome. In later decades, it would resurface again and again. In 2000, when the Bush-Gore recount stretched into chaos. In 2016, when FBI Director James Comey reopened the Clinton email inquiry just days before the vote. And in 2024, when a supposed peace deal with Israel and Gaza was put on hold, the ghost of 1980 linger, not because of what was proven, but because of what could never be disproven. Or perhaps the most haunting of all, a democracy cannot function on rumors, but it cannot ignore its own shadow either. Even as time passed, the story of 1980 refused to die. In the early 2000s, new documents surfaced. Former Iranian officials claimed, again, that contacts with the Reagan's team had taken place. None of it could be definitively proven, but each revelation rekindled debate. Historians revisited Gary Sick's claim, cross-checking archives and declassified cables. Few found gaps. moments in Casey's travel schedule that couldn't be explained. Others found contradictions that unraveled the theory entirely. But by then, proof no longer mattered. What endured wasn't evidence, it was doubt. The same doubt that fueled every claim of rigged elections, every suspicion of manipulation, every belief that something unseen is always pulling the strings. The October surprise lives not in documents, but in the national psyche. It represents a point where trust itself became negotiable. More than 40 years later, the October surprise remains an unsolved chapter in America's political lore. Newly declassified documents still surface: memos, diaries, intelligence reports. Some add color, some confusion. In 2023, researchers uncovered yet another piece of the puzzle. Note from Ben Barnes, a longtime political insider, suggesting that in 1980, former Texas Governor John Connally traveled to the Middle East, allegedly to pass messages urging Iran to delay the hostage release. Once again, the past whispered to the present. Once again, the evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. Maybe the truth is scattered across the classified archives and fading memories. Or maybe, as with so many political myths, the story persists because it can't be proven. It offers something every nation secretly craves: a single explanation for chaos.